Hey everyone, welcome to one of 3 videos talking about emergencies in the DCS Apache. In this video we're going to talk about SCAS off flight and how that works in DCS. Like the other videos, we're going to talk a little bit about some kind of DCS-isms first, and then we're going to talk about how to actually do the procedure. The first thing to talk about is one little DCS-ism here to do with the trim. Now, when you disable the channels of the stability system, pitch, roll, yaw and collective, you don't normally disable the trim system, and equally if you pull the FMC release paddle on the cyclic, the trim system will stay engaged, and that's all good. However, just to forewarn you that should you disable the trim system, there is a little bit of a DCS problem with that. If you look at the control indicator in the top left, you'll see that I can trim the aircraft as normal because the trim system's engaged. Now, if I switch the trim system off and the mag force trim turns off, you will notice now that the red X that marks the trimmed position in to the aircraft in DCS now is matched up to the cyclic, and that's fine, no problem. But you'll also notice that when I let go of my cyclic and it goes back to the physical center position, so my physical cyclic control in the real world is now centered, it still goes to that trimmed position. And that means that I now cannot access full back cyclic or full right cyclic because I was trimmed forward and left. And that's a problem because the trim system is disabled. I'm pressing the trim force trim release button now and nothing happens. So if you have a trim failure, not only will the sort of aircraft component, if you like, of the trim stop working, but the DCS simulation layer, that is the sort of remapping of your stick center position, that will also fail. And that's not a component of the aircraft that should be able to be damaged or to be switched off. That's part of the simulation engine, but for some reason that also switches off. Now, fortunately, one thing does still work, and that is the trim reset. That's a sim command, not an aircraft command. Now I've got that on a modifier and I'm going to press it, and you'll see it does snap back to the center position. And for this reason only, I would strongly suggest that you do have that trim reset mapped somewhere. You may never use it, but if for some reason the trim system fails in the DCS aircraft and you have off-center trim applied, you will be completely unable to reset it unless you have that trim reset, that simulation command trim reset mapped. So just something to be aware of. So we're going to switch the trim back on, and we're going to switch off in the util page the 4 channels off the SCAS, and we're going to get an FMC disengaged caution. So we're going to lift to the hover here with the SCAS off, and we'll see how the aircraft flies. And what you'll see essentially is that this is pretty straightforward. The aircraft's very controllable with all the stability systems off. You'll see on the control window that the green markers that show obviously what the SCAS is doing just don't move. They stay matched to the diamonds, which is where the controls are. And essentially what you lose is all the slight damping that happens on the aircraft movements. The aircraft becomes a little bit more unstable, particularly at high speed, and also the aircraft, if it develops a rolling or pitching moment and actually starts continuing or is continuing to pitch, you'll have to apply opposite control to stop that. And normally what will happen is if you let go of the controls or relax them back to the trimmed position, the aircraft will sort of stop its pitching or rolling. So we'll see that as we lift off to the hover, pull in some collective. We're getting slightly low on the skids. Just for reference, the aircraft's about 17,900. I've got 2 empty racks of Hellfires, full pod of smoke rockets outboard, and the FCR on, and 95% fuel, I think. So we're just going to lift off to the hover, and you'll see the aircraft wanders a little bit. The heading hold is obviously not functional, so the nose will yaw around a little bit, and you'll also see that if we get the aircraft pitching particularly down, nose down, we have to apply quite a lot of opposite stick to stop it, and then we pitch it up and it'll kind of bob up a bit. So you get less damping, and that's what you would expect. But other than that, as long as you're kind of delicate with the controls and you don't try and over-stabilize the aircraft, then actually this is totally controllable. There really is no problem. Anybody that's used to flying the Huey or one of the helicopters in DCS that has no stability augmentation, you'd be perfectly at home with this. It takes about 10 minutes to get used to, and I'd suggest that if you have this happen in flight, you're just going to, other battle damage accepting, you're going to do a bit of flying around and just get used to it before you probably come into a landing. It really isn't particularly more challenging than hovering under any other sort of adverse conditions. Transition to forward flight is very straightforward. The aircraft will transition perfectly well. Actually having the collective channel locked out, some people may think is an advantage at the moment in DCS. The aircraft's still maneuverable and will maneuver still aggressively. You're not going to lose any performance really. What you will find is the control gains will change. So one of the things the SCAS does is it sort of boosts the control input at low speed so that you have the same responsiveness at high speed and low speed, and the aircraft always kind of handles quote unquote the same. That effect is obviously gone now, so as the airspeed increases and the torque increases, you'll find that potentially the controls might become a little bit more responsive or less responsive depending on the speed range you're in. But yeah, there's no real difficulty in manoeuvring the aircraft in combat manoeuvring flight with no stability system. You're not going to have any problems getting home, landing, taking off, or even performing combat manoeuvres like this.
RPM high.
Because the you heard the caution go off, because the collective channel is not damped. If you waggle the collective around a lot, you're going to obviously spike your rotor RPM low or high, and equally transitioning to the hover is quite easy to get too much or get a lot of rotor RPM if you dump the collective and pull the nose up aggressively. So NOE quick stops and things like that, just be careful to manage your rotor. Trim will function as it normally does, as long as the trim channel is still engaged, and transition back to the hover should be very straightforward, and landing should be very straightforward. So really, this task is a bit of a non-event. It just requires a little bit of practice just to get used to it, and I think once you've done that once, then if it happens to you in flight, you'll be much quicker to transition back to being happy with no stability systems. That's pretty much it. I don't think there's anything else to say. Just make sure you've got that trim reset mapped, and if the trim system fails or we get a DCS situation where we can have battle damage for that, then we're able to reset the trim and actually land the aircraft. That's it.